Okay, now that we have seen a bunch of code smells and how to refactor them, let's work on a complete example. So the code we're working on is in a file called example1, which you can find in Solution Explorer under full refactoring folder. This code we have here is a user control that is used in ASP.NET WebForms applications. First, let's take a look at what the code does, and then we start refactoring it. So here in page load, first we create a DB context, which is an entity framework object to work with the database. Here we're checking the page is postback. So if that's true, that means the user filled out a form and clicked the post or save button. So here we create a validator object, then we create a post object, and we try to read the values in the text boxes on the page. So there's a text box called post title that has a text property. We read that and we set the title property of our entity. And then we ask the validator to validate that entity. And if the result is valid, we try to save that object to the database. Otherwise, we get a control called error summary, which is like a bulleted list. Then we iterate over the list of errors and somehow display the errors on the page. Now we have another else here, and look, the first problem here is I don't know what this block is all about. Else what? So I have to go up and realize, okay, that's the else for this if. So if the page is not post back, then this should happen, which is displaying a post on the form. So this is a problem with a long method. You have to scroll up and down to see what's happening. And also take a look at all these conditionals. If, else, for each, if, else, else. Whenever you see code like that, it's definitely a bad thing. So the first thing we want to do here is to break down this large method into a set of smaller methods. This method is doing too many things. Now, what do you think is the first thing that we can immediately take out of this method? I think the job of this method is to do some kind of coordination. So what I mean by that is if the page is post back, then something should happen. Otherwise, something else should happen. Now, what is that thing that is going to happen? We don't care. This method does not care. The job or responsibility of this method is to do that initial decision making or coordination. So the simplest thing we can take out is the content of this high-level if-else block. So put the cursor here. We select the entire block using Ctrl-W a few times. So like this. Look, the entire if block is selected. Now we do an extract method here. So in this block, we're trying to save a post. We map it, we validate it, and if it's fine, we save it. Otherwise, we display the result. So there's a lot of things happening here. Let's just call this method try save post. Okay. Let's take a look at our page load method. Now it's much simpler. I can immediately see what this else represents. Now let's do the same refactoring for this block here. So Ctrl-Shift-R, extract method. And here what we're trying to do is to display a post on the page. So let's just call it display post. Now let's get rid of all these extra curly braces that are getting in the way. We don't really want them. Okay, much better. This method is now telling me a story. If page is post back, try save post, otherwise display the post. Now this DB context here, that shouldn't be here. DB context here is a private field, and private fields should be initialized in the constructor, not in a method like page load. So next thing I want to do is create a constructor, and I have to cut this code here and paste it here. Better. Another problem I immediately see is the naming convention violation. So private fields should be named based on camel notation, prefixed with an underline. And look, ReSharper is already complaining about that. Look at this green underline here. So I put the cursor on the field, Alt and Enter, and look at the second option, rename to underline DB context. So this is the right name. But the underline is still there, which means there is another suggestion from ReSharper. Again, Alt and Enter. ReSharper is suggesting to make this field read-only. Why? Because this field is initialized in the constructor and that's it. Nowhere else in the code we are reinitializing this object. So let's go ahead with that. That's better. Now let's take a look at this display post method. Do you think we need this comment? No, we have a properly named method that reveals the intent. So let's get rid of it. Now this method may look pretty small. It's only 3 lines of code, but there is a problem here. Can you spot the problem? And let me give you a hint. The problem is about violation of single responsibility principle. Did you figure it out? So the problem is, in this line, you're trying to get a post object from the database. So this bit of code is about data access, whereas these 2 lines is about presentation of data. Now we are in a user control, and a user control is about the presentation. It's part of the presentation layer. So this bit does not belong to this class at all. It's part of our data access layer. The only thing is, if we select the entire line and we try to extract it, it's going to fail. Why? Because here we have a reference to request object. We're trying to get the ID of the post to display via query string. So I cannot move this to a separate class immediately. We have to do step-by-step refactoring. So how should we do that? Ideally, I would like to have a class called post repository, which is responsible for getting posts from the database or saving a post to the database. Now, if we have a method called getPost, that method needs an ID. That should be a parameter. And that's where we have this bit here. So we want to make this a parameter of that potential method. So the first thing we want to do here is to extract this expression into a variable. So we select it, Ctrl+Shift+R, introduce variable. Now this is something about ReSharper that I don't like. Let me press the escape here. When you try to do an extract variable or extract parameter as part of a link expression, it ends up adding these curly braces and turning that into a code block. That's not what we want. It's bringing a lot of baggage. We have to extract this separately and then get rid of this return keyword here and the curly braces. It's just too much work. So let's undo this. A better way is just to select that using Ctrl+W. There you go. So we cut it with Ctrl+X. And now let's introduce a variable manually here. So let's call it post ID. Now we see the red highlight and the red icon. So we press Alt and Enter. And the first option is create local variable. There you go. And I assign it to what I cut earlier. So Ctrl+V, there you go. Now if you look at this method, there is no reference to request or query string. So there is no reference to the web. We can move it to a repository. So the next step is to extract a method from this line. So we select the entire line. Ctrl+Shift+R, extract method. Let's call this method getPost. Take a look at the preview. So the getPost method receives a post ID and returns a post object. It's pretty meaningful. And look, inside this method, we have a reference to DB context, which is an entity framework object, which is part of our data access layer. And there is no reference to request or query string. We just have a post ID, which is a parameter to this method. That's great. Now this method is currently inside the same class, our user control. At some point, we're going to move it into a repository, but I'm not going to do it straight away because I want to show you something before getting there. Let's take a look at try save post. this method here. Look, once we validated the post object, then we're going to save it to the database. So here we have the same problem. We have data access code mixed with presentation code. So we're going to do another extract method here. Ctrl+Shift+R, extract method. Let's call this method save post. Look, save post receives a post object and uses DB context to add that to the database. I would like to change the parameter name from entity to post. It's more meaningful. Let's go ahead. Okay. Again, this new method is inside the current class. Let's take a look at this method. So I put the cursor here, Control B. There you go. Do we need this comment? No. And look, when I change the name of the parameter in that dialog box from entity to post, unfortunately, ReSharper could not figure out to rename this object here. So we have to manually do that. Now, the next thing I want to do is to put this method, save post, close to the method we extracted earlier, which was get post, right? So let's move this method up. I'm going to select the method with Control W. Now we want to move it up. So Shift, Control, Alt, and up. Let's scroll up a little bit. There it is. So we've got get post and save post. Actually, I would like to move both of them a bit further up and put them close to the DB context declaration. So let's select both of these methods. Again, Shift, Control, Alt, up. Let's scroll up a little bit here. So I want to move these two right next to this private field. Shift, Control, Alt, up. There you go. Now take a look at this part of code. This is purely about data access, which does not belong here. So now is the right time to extract a separate class from this. With the code selected, Ctrl+Shift+R, extract class. We're going to call this new class, let me put this here, post repository. And note that once we extract that class, this post control, our original class, is going to have a reference to the extracted class called underline post repository. We just have two problems here, as you see with the red icons. Because these methods get post and save post are declared as private, we cannot call them from post control. So we simply make them public. So we are moving all these three members together into a new class. And here we can tell ReSharper to put it in the same file or in a different file. I would like this repository class to be in a different file. We want to have one class per file. So let's go ahead. We got an error. Let's see what's happening here. So it's saying ambiguous reference post repository. Basically what happened was before recording this, I was practicing on my own. So I have another post repository in the project. And that's why ReSharper is not sure which post repository we're talking about here. So if you're doing it on your own, you're not going to see this error. Let's see how we can resolve this problem. So I go to Solution Explorer. So in post repository, there you go. I see the problem. Yes. So we have one post repository class here and another one here, which is because of the mistake I made. Don't worry about it. I'm just going to delete it. Okay, good. Problem is solved. Let's get back to our example one. All right. So this class looks a bit cleaner than when we started. Let's get rid of this extra white space. Now we have a post repository. We initialize it in the constructor. And when we want to display a post, we ask the repository, give me that post by that ID. And then we simply display it. The only thing that I don't like here is that variable name, entity. Let's change it to post to be more meaningful. There you go. I'm reasonably happy with this method. I think everything is good. Let's move on. Try save post. Now this is an interesting example. So in this method, we've got a post validator. Then we create a post object. We ask the validator to validate it. If it's valid, we save it. Otherwise, we want to display the errors. So the first problem I see is this block here. All these lines are highly related, which means we can extract them and put them in a separate method. So Ctrl+Shift+R, extract method. Let's call this method display errors. Look at the preview. This method takes an argument of type validation result and simply displays the errors. And its return type is void. It's pretty meaningful. So next, much better. Now let's get rid of all these extra braces that get in the way. Don't like them. Okay, our method is now even shorter. There is one more thing we can extract here, and that is this bit here. See, in these few lines, as part of initialization of that entity, we are reading the values of our text boxes on the screen. And that is a specific job on its own. It's got nothing to do with validation. So these few lines are again highly related and unrelated from this part, which means we can select this entire block and extract it into a method called getPost. So the job of this method is to read the values from the text boxes on the form and return a properly initialized object. Much better. Now you see the lack of symmetry. Here we have post validator, then var, then validation result. It's much better to use var. It keeps your code cleaner. Look, post validator repeated twice. We don't really need that. So put the cursor here, and ReSharper is already suggesting that with the green underline. So Alt and Enter, use var. And same here. Much better.